The NC Everything podcast has had us on Hatteras Island a few times. It came up when I talked about the prisoners of war in North Carolina in episode 64. Then there was episode 49 on lighthouses. It came up again during the Mountains to Sea Trail in episode 80. And the most recent time was during my 3 days in the Outer Banks episode, which was episode 81. Well, I have finally decided to dedicate an entire episode to this really special island in the Outer Banks. So today, we're going to Hatteras, officially. Welcome to the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is episode, I don't remember, of the show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. If this is your first time listening to the NC Everything podcast, thanks for joining in. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. I want to go ahead and knock out the social media stuff. So if you like the show, you can subscribe on YouTube if you're watching, or wherever you're listening to podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. You can also join the Facebook group by searching the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook, but there's a link for that down below. And the most important link in the description is the contact button. I think I put it in there. Actually, I don't know if I've been putting the contact button in there the past few episodes. Again, I've said in the past few episodes that I was a little rusty. I took a little break. But if you want to contact me, there is a link to the website, and the contact button is there. I'll try to make sure the contact button is in the description. But the reason it is my favorite link in the description is because I get to hear from the listeners. And I say in every episode, I love hearing from the listeners about anything. Sometimes it's just, hey, I like the show. But sometimes there's episode suggestions. I just recently received a suggestion from Kristen from Missouri, and I am currently working on her suggestion right now. It's going to be a couple episodes out, though. But a large part of this show has been based on listener suggestions. So don't be shy. Reach out, say hello. I try to respond to everybody. I do respond to everybody. I just don't know about a timely fashion. There's been a few times where I opened up my email and I had a listener write me from 3 or 4 weeks ago. I do get distracted. I get busy. As you can see behind me, I'm in my welding shop. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see behind me. I have a lot of different things going on. I'm a welding instructor. Full-time, and I weld at home and with 2 kids and some of my personal stuff going on that some of you returning listeners already know about. Sometimes I forget to open up my email, but as soon as I see that one of my listeners has reached out to me, I get back to them as soon as I can. All right, now speaking of my personal life, just to wrap up this story that's been going on since June, since the last episode that came out, my dad did ultimately pass away. And it is sad. I'm not trying to make this a sad episode or a sad intro. I miss my dad. I miss my mom. But in a lot of cases, he was in a bad place there at the end. And I'm glad he's not in that place anymore. I will forever miss my dad. But I won't miss seeing him in that situation. And I know the past few episodes I've mentioned what's going on in my personal life. I'm not glad all of it's over. But I think now we have kind of reached the end of that era in my personal life. Whether that's good or bad, I guess that's debatable. Now, before we get into the content, I just want to say that I have been scripting this show the past few episodes. It makes it easier or faster to record, and I can kind of get my thoughts together without the camera rolling. But I'm not just reading this script word for word. I am trying to engage with the camera. But if I don't look up a lot, it is because I have this show kind of scripted in front of me. But I guess that only applies to the YouTube viewers. If you're listening on a podcast player, it doesn't matter where I look. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the content. Like I said, we're going to Hatteras Island. The Outer Banks are special to me. I don't get out there near enough. But the Outer Banks it's a landscape that I don't think you'll find anywhere else in this country, but you may not find anything like that anywhere else in the world. A lot of it is almost like straight out of some sort of fantasy film. It's literally just a strip of land in the Atlantic Ocean. And this strip of land has a road going right down the middle of it. Anyway, let's get to the script. Hatteras Island is a long island in the Outer Banks. It's on the east side of the Pamlico Sound, and it lies east and southeast of the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge and the Mattamuskeet National Wildlife Refuge. Now, the island itself is one of the longest islands in the continental United States. It's 42 miles long, and it's shaped kind of like a backwards L. Now, Hatteras Island isn't just a really long island. It also has a really, really long history. And you know I love origin stories and backstories. We're going to start this history at 500 AD. That's about how long ago the experts believed that the island was inhabited. So, of course, back then it was Native American tribes. Now, they survived off the island by eating fish and other wildlife that lived in and around the island. And I think there was also some farming, some small farming going on, not a whole lot. But the best part about living on Hatteras was that other tribes really had a hard time getting out there to mess with you. So while many tribes on the mainland kind of battled it out for territory and resources, the folks over on Hatteras Island, they were pretty much living peacefully. That is, until the explorers started showing up. The first European explorer that they believe showed up around the Hatteras area was an Italian explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano. He was Italian, but he was working for the French. He was trying to find a western route to China, but he found the coast of what would become North America instead. Anyway, the year was 1524 when he first landed in the Carolinas. They think he landed somewhere between Hatteras and Cape Lookout. But this story ain't so bad. It's said that he met friendly natives and he was friendly in return. He didn't interfere too much. He just said hello, had a look around. Well, then he got back in his boat and got the hell out of there before he was spotted by the Spanish. From here, he headed north and into history as the first explorer of the eastern United States. Now, the natives on Hatteras Island, they wouldn't see white man again for years. However, there was a map that was drawn in 1585. This was 61 years after Verrazzano landed. This map depicted Hatteras Island, but it called it Hatterask, Hatterask, supposedly named for the Hatteras tribe that lived there. I don't know if the tribe was really named Hatteras, or if that's just what we named them. But several times in history, the Hatteras tribe is mentioned. Now let's jump to 1587. This is 2 years after the map was drawn, or 63 years after Verrazzano landed. A man named Captain John White lands on Hatteras Island, and he has a bunch of settlers with him. But he also doesn't stay long. John White didn't know it at the time, but him and his settlers had a date with destiny on Roanoke Island to the north, and they set off. History would remember these folks as the lost colony of Roanoke. Now, just as a side note, these colonists, they may not have been lost at all. There is evidence that suggests that the colonists simply migrated south again to join up with the Hatteras natives. There's even stories told about blue-eyed Native American folks around Hatteras Island years later. And I did cover the lost colony in my Sir Walter Raleigh episode. I forgot to put a note in here which episode that was, but you can search it on the website. And again, the website is www.thenceverythingpodcast.com. Now, eventually, the Outer Banks did become settled by white men. In 1607, the Jamestown colony was established in what is now Virginia. As the colony grew and spread, people started finding their way to the Outer Banks. This was around the year 1700. And kind of like the natives that lived there at the time and before, these settlers, they relied heavily on fishing to survive. But also, they cut timber to supply lumber demands for shipbuilding, and farms started to pop up as well. Now, here's the thing about farming, fishing, and logging. You need to ship those goods to where they got to go. So during the 1700s, people found out the hard way that sailing around Hatteras Island was pretty dangerous and most of the time deadly. This was because the now infamous diamond shoals. I know I've said this on the show before, but a shoal is just another name for a sandbar, and Hatteras is quite known for shifting and unpredictable sandbars. So in 1794, the U.S. government decided that Hatteras Island needed a lighthouse. It would be another 5 years before they actually started building a lighthouse, and finally, 9 years after it was decided on, in October of 1803, the first lighthouse at 90 feet tall was lit. And it was useless. The light was too dim and ships could barely see it. But 50 years and a bunch of shipwrecks later, it was decided that the Hatteras Lighthouse could stand to grow a little more. and so they added 60 feet to make it a total height of 150 feet. It also got a red roof and a fancy new lens as well. Now let's talk about the one thing that pops up in a lot of my episodes. That's the Civil War. As most of you know by now, the Civil War breaks out in 1861, and the Outer Banks of North Carolina actually saw most of the state's action during the time. And I know one of the biggest surrenders of the Civil War happened in Durham, and one of the last battles of the Civil War happened down in Bentonville, so there was action away from the coast, but it's still true that most of the action of the Civil War in North Carolina happened along the coast. Now, like all of North Carolina, Hatteras started out as a Confederate territory, but that changed the very first year of the war with the Battle of Hatteras Inlet. It was August 1861. U.S. Major General John E. Wool was on the coast of Virginia at Fort Monroe. He got some troops together to help the Navy take down some Confederate forts. This was the first time in the war that a joint action had taken place between Army and Navy. So U.S. Major General John E. Wool, he hands his men over to Benjamin Butler. And General Benjamin Butler, he would command the operation to take down the Confederate forts. So the Army climbs aboard 7 Navy ships and they head for the Carolinas. Now down in North Carolina, there were 2 main forts guarding Hatteras Inlet. They were earthen forts, which on the coast is to say that they were made of sand and logs. One of the forts, Fort Clark, was the closest to the ocean, and it protected the mouth of the inlet. Not quite a mile away to the west was Fort Hatteras. It protected the main channel. Now, there was a lot of issues with this defense, but the main issue was that Fort Hatteras was still under construction. They hadn't even finished building it yet. So at the time of the battle, there were literally cannons laying in the sand that hadn't been put into position yet. U.S. troops show up on August 27th, and on the morning of August 28th, the Navy opens fire on Fort Clark. Now, while they're bombing Fort Clark, the Army loads into a bunch of small boats, and they head for the shore. Now, the cannons on Fort Clark, they were returning fire, but the ships were out of range. So Fort Clark was definitely outgunned. Now, by the time the U.S. troops landed on the beach, all their gunpowder had been soaked from the waves and the splash from the sea. So essentially, they would have been sitting ducks once they got to the beach. However, Fort Clark was out of ammo, so the Confederates abandoned the fort and they headed west to Fort Hatteras. The Union followed this retreat and they began to attack Fort Hatteras, but the men at Hatteras returned fire and they actually got in some good hits. The Union backed off for the night. The next day, they hit Fort Hatteras again. But this time, they stayed out of range of the guns at Fort Hatteras, just like they did at Fort Clark. So they're bombing Fort Hatteras, and the men at Fort Hatteras, they can't even get a single shot to land. So eventually, they give up the fort. Now the Union has free reign of the Outer Banks and a golden gate to the NC mainland. 6 months after these 2 forts fell, the Union would gain control of Roanoke Island as well. Eventually, the Civil War did come to an end, and it was back to business as usual. And the first order of business was back to the lighthouse. You see, the lighthouse by this time was in horrible disrepair, and they realized that they needed a new one. So in the fall of 1870, construction began on the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States. It would measure out at 198.5 feet, and the light could be seen up to 16 miles away. It would take them 2 years to finish this lighthouse. A year after they finished building the new lighthouse, the old lighthouse was torn down. And this new lighthouse, it really did help to save a lot of sailors. But for everyone they saved, it seemed like there was another one in trouble somewhere. So this is when they developed the U.S. Life-Saving Service. I talked about some of these guys in episode 54 on Pea Island Life-Saving Station. Anyway, in 1915, the U.S. Life-Saving Service would be rebranded as the U.S. Coast Guard, and there are several Coast Guard stations all along the Outer Banks. But I want to back up a few years before we move on. Before the National Weather Service became the National Weather Service, it started out as the United States Weather Bureau in 1870. One of the first weather stations was built on Hatteras Island, because if the sandbars aren't bad enough, wait till you see the weather. Anyway, it was April 14th, 1912. Does that date sound familiar to anybody? That night, the station was being manned by Richard Daly and Horace Gaskins. Now these 2 men, they're kind of just chilling out at the weather station when all of a sudden they get an urgent telegram. The message came in at 11:25 p.m. from a ship named RMS Titanic, and it read, CQD, have struck iceberg. As soon as they read the message, they forwarded it to their headquarters in New York. This message was received by a young man named David Sarnoff. Now, another side note, David Sarnoff would one day become the president of the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA. Anyway, the Titanic was famous for being unsinkable. Everybody knew that, including David Sarnoff. So he wrote the message off as some kind of twisted joke. He told the North Carolina boys that it was just a hoax and told them not to respond to any more of these messages claiming to be the sinking Titanic. What they didn't know was that the Titanic really was sinking. And what many of you may not know is that this message that was received on Hatteras Island was most likely the very first distress message received from the doomed crew of the Titanic. You see, most people acknowledge that the fatal hitting of the iceberg happened at 11:40 p.m. Titanic sent her first distress messages at 12:15 a.m. The Carolina boys received a distress message at 11:25 p.m. Hatteras is an hour behind the location of the Titanic, which would indicate that Hatteras received a message at 11:25 Carolina time or 12:25 Titanic time. Anyway, history moves on. But in 2005, they were cleaning out the old weather station. Well, back in the day, they would insulate the walls by shoving old papers into the wall cavity. They were cleaning these old papers out of the wall, and they found an old page from the station log that told of receiving a telegram on April 14th, 1912, from the RMS Titanic. Today, this station log is on display at the Hatteras Maritime Museum, and I've seen it when I visited the museum last summer. Now let's talk about the World Wars. During World War I, Germany invaded U.S. waters right off the coast of North Carolina using U-boats. Now the term U-boat comes from the German term Unterseeboot, which means undersea boat. Now during that time, 3 U-boats sank at least 10 ships right off the coast of North Carolina. This German naval action was repeated during World War II. About 6 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U-boats started showing up in North Carolina. They figured out that the waters around Hatteras Island were already pretty dangerous, so that's why they targeted ships there. Attacks were so frequent off the coast of Hatteras Island that the area became known as Torpedo Junction. Now the military, they didn't want to create panic, so they did what the military always does, and they lied. I mean, the public knew there were U-boats off the coast of North Carolina, but the military, they didn't let the North Carolina people know exactly how many U-boats were out there, and it was a lot. In fact, there were more U-boats off the coast of North Carolina during World War II than there were anywhere else in the United States. And even today, a lot of people don't realize how close Germany came to the United States. Now, the lighthouse on Hatteras Island isn't the only thing that defines Hatteras Island, but it's a big part of the history, and so I have to talk about the lighthouse again. We're going to 1999. The beach in front of Hatteras Lighthouse was almost gone. It had been getting smaller for years and years. In fact, the actual island itself is slowly moving to the west. When they built the lighthouse in 1870, it was 1,500 feet from the sea. By 1970, there was only 120 feet of land left between the lighthouse and the waves. So finally, in 1999, they decided to move Hatteras Lighthouse and all the historic buildings around it. It took a really long time, but they moved it 2,900 feet away from the ocean. Now, I talked about this during my lighthouse episode, but we went down there while they were moving it. I mean, it was highly televised on local television anyway. But that year, we had taken a family trip to the Outer Banks. We got as close as we could to the migrating tower. I remember being disappointed that we couldn't get closer to what was going on, but it was really cool to share in that part of our state's history. During my 3 days in the Outer Banks, I took my family to the lighthouse. You can hardly tell that it was ever sitting anywhere else. It looks like it has been in that spot for a century. Now we're getting kind of close to the end of this episode, but I want to back up and tell you about something that I intentionally skipped over. I skipped over it so that I could tell you the whole story without skipping around. I want to tell you about Cape Hatteras National Seashore, the very first national seashore in U.S. history. And I'm going to cut out of here how many times I stumbled trying to say national seashore. Cape Hatteras National Seashore was authorized by Congress in 1937. However, it would be 16 more years before the national seashore was actually established. That was 1953. Then 5 years after that, in 1958, it was formally dedicated as the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Well, why did it take so long? It's mainly because of the sheer size of it. It contains 28,500 acres and 70 miles of shoreline, and you can't acquire that kind of real estate overnight. At the beginning of it, people were freely volunteering their land for the national seashore, but by the end of it, the government was condemning properties in order to gain ownership. Now, I don't mean to sound bitter, but it has always kind of bothered me that the government can condemn your land, meaning it isn't fit for you to live on anymore. And as soon as you're gone, a park or a shopping center pops up. So it's not safe for you, but it's safe for hundreds of other folks. Anyway, after they got all the land they needed, they called in the CCC. That's the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, these guys have popped up in the NC Everything podcast a few times. They helped out with Uwharrie, and I think the Blue Ridge Parkway too. Well, the CCC got to work preserving beaches and sand dunes. The thing about Cape Hatteras National Seashore is that it isn't just on Hatteras Island. Inside the National Seashore is the southern tip of Body Island and almost all of Ocracoke and Hatteras Island. And the only way to get there is on Highway 12. Highway 12, I talked about at the beginning of this show, that strip of land sitting out in the Atlantic Ocean with a little highway on it, that's Highway 12. And just to reiterate, this highway, it don't look bad when you're driving on it. It looks like a road, and there's sand on the left, there's sand on the right. And depending on which way you're heading, sometimes you can see water on the left and the right, but it doesn't look that bad. But if you look at it from above, from like a drone or a plane, you are literally driving on a tiny strip of land. It looks pretty scary. The Pamlico Sound is on the west, and the Atlantic Ocean is on the east. And if I can, I'll post a link to a picture of Highway 12 seen from above. So like I said, Cape Hatteras National Seashore was the very first national seashore in the United States. The next one to come was in 1961 with the Cape Cod National Seashore up in Massachusetts. Another notable seashore is Gulf Island National Seashore. It's the largest national seashore in the United States at 160 miles long, and it stretches to part of Florida and into Mississippi. On the west coast, there is only one lonely national seashore, and that's Point Reyes National Seashore, which is located just north of San Francisco, California. And I feel like the more I say national seashore, my lips are starting to work less and less. So I'm glad I think I'm done with that word. In fact, I'm done using all these terms because that's the end of this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and it was actually a lot of fun to research and put this show together. Some of my research gets kind of daunting. I had to read through a lot of stuff, and a lot of it, because I read so many articles and so many sources, a lot of it repeats itself. So I'm looking for new information to kind of add and thicken up the episode. But with Hatteras, I did read a lot of repeat information, but I really enjoyed reading all about the Outer Banks and Hatteras and the history of it. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe to the show so you don't miss episode. Facebook, YouTube, the links are in the description below. I have a few episodes that are almost ready to go. I don't know which one I'm going to get to yet. Kristen, your suggestion, it's coming. It's not going to be the next episode, but it is coming. And if you have a suggestion, don't hesitate to write in. And with that, I guess I'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.